It is unequivocal that human activities are responsible for climate change. That's the finding of a new study by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's the most up-to-date assessment of how global warming will change the world in the coming decades. Environmental experts have called it a massive wake-up call to governments to cut emissions. 234 authors from 66 countries have worked on the landmark assessment. The report says global average temperature rise could reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 20 years. Now that is 10 years sooner than expected. That temperature rise will breach the ambition of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement and bring widespread devastation and unprecedented extreme weather. This all comes less than 3 months before the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow in Scotland. Vital UN talks that will determine the future course of efforts to tackle climate change. And the UK minister responsible for delivering COP26 has released this statement following the publication of today's report. He says, "Our message to every country, government, business and part of society is simple. The next decade is decisive. Follow the science and embrace your responsibility to keep the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius alive."
As we think this morning about caring for creation, there is no doubt that our climate is in crisis. As that new news report says, and will have heard others over the last few years, climate change in the world is accelerating. Creatures and plants are dying at an alarming rate, and carbon emissions from humans, in particular from human activity, has seen that temperature rise, and that's led to an increasing number of extreme weather events. And as we've seen, even over this last summer, those extreme weather events appear to be intensifying. And so on this Harvest Sunday, we have to ask ourselves as God's people, as Christians, well then what is our response to this crisis in creation? And the answer is that our Creator's mission is our mission too. Now, if you want to know what our Creator's mission is, then if you want to turn back to that Bible reading that we heard a few minutes ago, Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 23, then you can see it in the middle of this Bible reading. If you had a set of message notes given to you, or if you picked up a set of message notes as you came in, then that will help you as well. But God's mission is summed up in verse 20 of this Bible reading. Through Christ, God reconciled everything to himself. Through Christ, God reconciled everything to himself. Reconciliation is the mission of God. Reconciliation is the mission of our Creator, and our mission is our Creator's mission. So therefore, our mission must be reconciliation. Why did God reconcile everything to himself? Because God is love. He was the one who created our world, and he loves our world. And because he loves our world, he wants to reconcile it, to make the relationship between creation and God right. One of the most famous verses in the Bible is John chapter 3, verse 16, which says, God so loved the world. It doesn't say God so loved humans. God so loved men and women and children. It says God so loved the world. And that includes creation. And that's why God sent his Son into the world. Not just to reconcile human beings with God and with each other, but to reconcile himself and ourselves with creation. God sent his Son not just to save human beings, but to save the planet too. And God's mission is our mission, and so we have a role to play in helping to save the planet. I have a colleague, in fact she was commissioned as a Salvation Army officer this past summer, And we used to joke together that if we didn't know the answer to a difficult theological question that we were asked in college, then the answer is always Jesus. You can't be wrong if you answer with the word Jesus. Well, that's exactly what Paul is saying in this section that we looked at this morning in Colossians chapter 1. I almost don't want to preach this sermon because Paul's language is so eloquent in this passage that I don't think I can really add anything to it. But the whole basis of what he's writing in Colossians chapter 1 is that Jesus is the center of it all. And so in verses 15 and 16 at the opening of the passage, he says, Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. He existed before anything was created, and he is supreme over all creation. For through him, God created everything in the heavenly realms and on the earth. He made the things we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones, kingdoms, rulers and authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through him and for him. Paul says Christ is the visible expression of the invisible God. If you want to know what God looks like, or if anybody ever says to you, well, who is this God that you're talking about? What does he look like? Then point them to Christ. Christ is the visible expression of the invisible God. And Paul tells us that he was the creative purpose that shaped creation. Everything that you see around you, the trees and the flowers and the animals and humans, it was God, it was Christ, the creative purpose, who shaped creation. And he remains supreme over it. We might look at it today and see the way that it breaks down and we wonder who's in control. Paul tells us Christ is supreme over creation. He is the unifying person who underlies the whole cosmos and continues to hold it together. It always amazes me whenever I look into science that scientists will tell you just one thing needs to be a little bit out of kilter and the whole thing would fall apart. That's why we as Christians should be so worried about climate change, because it's getting things out of kilter. And Paul tells us that Christ holds it all together. And God is reconciling, making relationships right with all things, not just humans, in Jesus Christ. You see, creation needs a saviour just as much as humans do. I don't know if you've ever heard it, read it somewhere, perhaps you've heard sermons on it, but have you heard someone say that there are two dimensions to the cross? Anybody? No, just me that's heard sermons on that? Okay, one or two people maybe. Yeah? So there's the vertical dimension, okay, which talks about Jesus' work on the cross reconciling us with God. Yeah? Is it coming back to you now? Think, oh, well, maybe I have heard something about this. Yeah? The vertical dimension, Jesus' work on the cross reconciles our relationship with God. And then there's the horizontal dimension. Jesus' work on the cross reconciles our relationships with each other. Yeah? Heard that now? Thank you, Aidan. Aidan has, definitely. There's one or two other nods as well. Well, Shane Claiborne says that there was one very early Christian who said there's actually a third dimension to the cross as well, because the cross was firmly planted in the earth. And that dimension tells us that through Christ's work on the cross, God was also reconciling creation with himself through Christ. Three dimensions. God is reconciling our relationship with him. He's reconciling our relationship with each other. And he's reconciling his relationship and our relationship with creation. I don't know what your response is to climate change. If you listen to the news, even this morning, then we do seem to spend an awful lot of time deciding how we can save the planet. Okay, so our Prime Minister is going off to New York this week to talk about COP26, which you heard about in the news report. We spend an awful lot of time thinking about how to save the planet. But what Paul tells us here is that only Jesus Christ can save the planet. Only Jesus Christ can save the planet. Does that mean that we just sit back and see what happens? Well, no, because God's mission is our mission. We have a role to play in it. Our role is to take up Christ's cross and follow him, do what he does as far as creation is concerned. Our role is to take up our cross and firmly plant it in the earth and do what we can to reconcile ourselves with creation too. And so our question this morning is this: are we as connected to creation as Jesus is? Are we as connected to creation as Jesus is? Jesus is the answer. He's the center of it all. Everything begins and ends with him, Paul says. Creation is totally connected to him, and he is totally connected to creation. And if that's true, if we really believe that Jesus is at the center of it all, then we should live completely for him. If Jesus Christ is the center of creation, if it's him that's holding everything together, then it's natural. It's the natural order to do everything we can to live completely for him. If Jesus is the center of it all, then it's irrational to do anything else other than to follow him and learn to live his will. If Jesus is the center of everything, then that calls for our total commitment, including our commitment towards looking after and caring for creation. If we believe Paul's words this morning, and if we believe that Jesus is totally connected to our climate, then we have to be totally connected to our climate too. And so we ask ourselves this morning, well, how are we following Christ's example? Are we doing what we can to reconcile and restore our broken climate? As we take up our cross for Jesus, are we planting it firmly in the earth and helping to reconcile ourselves to earth? Bishop Tom Wright says this, and this is the call for the church today: the whole creation is waiting in eager longing for God's children to be revealed. In other words, for the unveiling of those redeemed humans through whose stewardship creation will at last be brought back into that wise order for which it was made. It's a tall order, but Bishop Tom Wright is saying, and he's saying it from the words that we read in the Bible, is that redeemed humans, Christians and churches, are the ones whose stewardship of creation will at last bring back creation into the wise order for which it was made. Our climate is in crisis. The trend is that the world will have warmed by between 3 and 5 Celsius by the end of this century. As you heard in that news report at the beginning, 6 years ago, countries around the world pledged to keep that warming to 1.5 Celsius. But it's clear we are not doing enough to do that. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, says if we're going to keep to that 1.5 degree warming, then it requires rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. We have to do something if that is going to happen. And so if we want to be part of God's mission in reconciling creation with him, then we need to think about the changes that we make. We need to see God's creation as he sees it, full of his beauty and his majesty. Now, I don't know about you, but I can kind of agree with all of that and say, yes, we should be doing something, but I haven't got a clue what we can do. Or maybe this little video can help, just some small changes that we might be able to make in our lives to help reconcile creation with God and help bring around its restoration. Have a look. So there's some ideas. We can reduce some of the things that we do. We can reduce some of the things that we buy. We can reuse stuff. We can recycle. Now, quite often, I don't know whether you feel a little flutter as you take your stuff out to the recycling bin and you think I'm doing my bit. But that video reminds us that recycling should really be the last resort because it still uses energy. Repair, don't bin. Things seem to be designed to break these days, and then we just replace them instead of trying to repair them. Rent, borrow, and share. We don't have to own everything. Refuse to believe the adverts that tell you need this and you need that, and if you haven't got that, then you're not up to much. And that will help reduce some of the things that we buy and do. And then rejoice in all that God has given us for free. I'm going to ask you to reflect on that. If you're meeting in a small group this week, then in your message notes, there's some questions that you can discuss and reflect on, and some prayer subjects that we can pray around. But also, hopefully, as you came into the hall this morning, you picked up one of these commitment cards, which just asks us to think about committing to something, maybe one of those 7 things that we've just looked at, to help care for God's creation and to help reduce climate change. For COVID reasons, I haven't handed pens out, so you may not have a pen with you, but if you have, I invite you to think about something that you can commit to and write it on that commitment card. If you haven't got a pen, then maybe take it home and commit to writing something in that box when you get home. We're going to listen to a beautiful song, which I know we've used before, but we're going to listen to it. Creation Calls, reminding us that we see God everywhere in creation. And we can take these moments as we listen to the song to commit to doing one thing to help reduce climate change and care for God's creation.
river's edge, standing on guard, while a deer and fawn drink from the stream. The smell of tilled earth just after the rain. A rainbow, dazzling natural colors. The sight of a hawk as it circles in the thermal drafts of summer. A flock of Canada geese flying in perfect formation. Rising from the valley floor, rolling hills covered with trees. Birch, maple, elm, and beech turning fiery red, yellow, and gold in the autumn air. A leaf on its brief journey, twisting, turning, dancing its way to the ground. Lifting our eyes, the mountains rise. Trees giving way to rock, cliffs, ice, snow, glaciers, majestic, jagged peaks. And as the sun slips behind the horizon and night falls, the mountains become silent fortresses, silhouetted against the night sky. The countless stars shining in silent testimony. Snowflakes gently falling, each unique, whispering, remember the mercy of God. Remember the mercy. Covering all the world in white. And then the quiet of creation at rest.